Hello, everyone, and I want to thank everyone who's watching today for the American Kinesiology Association and our chance to bring these amazing webinars on a variety of topics. But today we're definitely going down the track of our diversity, equity, inclusion track and presenting a unique topic that we had requested. And so today's topic is on the representation of lived experiences of Asians in kinesiology. I have two amazing guests who volunteered to share their experience and time on this. I'm going to let them both introduce themselves and where they're at. Kanai, if you would go first.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kanai Haneshi. I am currently at the Valley City State University in North Dakota.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jenny O. I'm a professor at Cal State East Bay in California.
Thank you so much. I know when we talked, I think the idea was we were talking about 30 or 40 minutes to figure out some ideas, and then man, it just kept going. And so we have a lot of great topics today. So we'll see how much we get to cover in our hour time frame, and we'll see the questions that get to come in. So for those who are listening, please feel free to not only like and subscribe to the different sources. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube today going live. A copy of this will be on YouTube as well as Facebook afterwards, so you can back to refer it if you want to. Additionally, you will also, if you want to send a comment in, please do so. Those go straight to me and I get to get a hold of those. I'll share those comments either if it's relevant to the topic at hand at the time or at the end when I get a chance to. But thank you so much for your support out there. But definitely leave a comment so we have things to feed off of. And so I guess my first question I'm going to ask, and I do apologize when it looks like my eyes look around. I have three screens in front of me, so it does look like I do this as I'm monitoring everything that we do. But if you guys wouldn't mind sharing your specific ethnic background, because that's been kind of the topic that we've brought up at hand when it comes to people's assumptions, and kind of discuss the amount of diversity that exists within different Asian cultures.
Kanai, do you want to go first?
Go ahead.
I'll start us off. All right. So I'm ethnic Chinese. My mom and dad actually were. My dad was born in Vietnam, and my mom her family had headed over to Vietnam at some time when she was young. So I identify as Chinese Canadian. So we were refugees and we fled Vietnam. It was during the time where Chinese families, it was the ethnic cleansing period. So if we were found, we would have been slaughtered. So we fled, and we were fortunate enough to be sponsored in part by the Canadian government and in part by a private organization, and that's how we ended up in Canada. So that's where I grew up. So I identify as Chinese Canadian. And then maybe, Kanai, do you want to speak to that, and then maybe we can address the second part of Daniel's question?
Yeah, sure. So I am straight Japanese. So I was born in Japan. I grew up in Japan until I was 22. So I speak Japanese as my first language and English as a second language. So I have been in United States now for about 20 years or so. But I am straight. My mom and dad are Japanese, and then my ancestors are all Japanese.
And then, so Daniel, if I'm remembering correctly, the second part of your question was to speak to sort of as best we can, the breadth of
Yes.
what all falls under the Asian
label. I think that discussion we had when we were talking, that the issue of, well, when someone says, oh, we might be just meeting a faculty member who has an Asian background, things like that, assumptions get made very quickly, right? Mm-hmm. And so kind of talk about really the breadth of what's considered inside, as again, like you said, as best you can inside the diversity of Asian culture. So.
Mm-hmm. So, I know, for myself, I'm certainly not an expert at sort of, all, what would constitute Asian, but, I'm aware that oftentimes people tend to think East Asian when someone says Asian, right? So perhaps people that maybe look more like Kanai and myself, so from perhaps Chinese, it might be Korean, it might be Japanese, but you've also got, Southeast Asians, you've got Southern Asians. Some would say that Western Asians exist. I know that that's more, some people think that and some not, but, overall, I think, I remember a DEI session I was in, and someone had mentioned that there's, close to 30 different groups that might fall under Asian. And so, the breadth is there. I mean, the amount of groups that would identify as Asian, I think, is much greater than most people realize.
Right. I want to echo that too. I think it's like just a little bit of lack of awareness of people, that when people just use the term of Asian people, and the Asian people is from like, people from like Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, that area of the world, to like Jenny said, like China, Japan, like that East Asia, and then there's like Middle South Asia, of like India, and then Pakistan. They're like all like different regions. We like look at different, culture is so diverse in there. I think there's a lack of awareness that when people talk about, okay, so Asian people, like I think it is very important to be clarify that, because like again, I think we're gonna go into the talk about like cultural backgrounds and stuff like that too. But then like that's different too, like. And then like more so like, if I think it's a funny thing, so I think when we talked about like today's webinar is like, even like between like Japanese and then Chinese and like South Koreans, like we look alike, but then like our language is completely different. We cannot talk to each other if we like talking to our language. So that's a diversity that like I think we wanna kind of people to be aware when we are talking about like Asian.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. That the proximity even does not equate to necessarily similarity in culture, in the aspect that I think expectation takes place outside of, and so. And that kind of leads to, I know this is going to be a factor that plays throughout several of our questions, but one of the straightforward questions I think came up that we discussed, I think that needs to really be addressed is, so are those of Asian descent considered a marginalized group? This is a question I've seen on talk shows and that gets raised. And I think, again, we talked about assumptions, but, is, those of Asian descent technically considered marginalized?
Mm-hmm. Do you want to go first? I went first last
yes,
time.
depending on where you are, but I would definitely say yes in the United States to that question.
Yeah, and I would add, I think a lot of it depends on, I think perhaps there's a lack of a universally shared definition of marginalization, right? So some people might relate that to oppression, some may relate that to discrimination, some may relate that to underrepresentation, and so I think in some ways it's understandable that there's this lack of clarity, right? If Asians are really, whether you would say marginalized or a minority, right? Because I think depending on where you live, it seems like, well, there's so many quote unquote Asians around. Could they certainly be marginal? How could they be marginalized or, discriminated against if there seem to be, depending on where you live, in such large numbers? So I think, for me, when, in terms of marginalization, I think I tend to more so think about, I guess, for me, it's more like, do Asians have to experience living in a place that perhaps culturally is different than how they were socialized and raised? And to that question, my answer is yes, right? And so I think an example that I often give is, I don't know how many people who may be listening right now, right? But I know growing up when I was, we grew up quite low income. Money we had to really make everything last. And I remember being in elementary school and middle school, and one of the biggest stressors of each of my days was deciding what to bring to lunch, because I quickly learned that no matter what I had brought, I would get made fun of, or there would be comments about that's disgusting or that smells, and so I think about, we moved to Canada when I was, less than 2 years old. So I guess my point is I never heard anyone say like that maybe traditionally, that food item that comes from perhaps North American culture looks disgusting or smells disgusting, or what is that? How can you eat that? I didn't see other people that perhaps didn't look like me have that experience. So I think there is a lot of differential treatment of Asians that perhaps people don't notice or don't realize can actually create quite a bit of psychological or mental strain on people.
Yes, yeah.
So with that in mind, that kind of leads to the second question that kind of relates to it. Since you brought up the difference of comparing marginalized groups, what are the challenges to those who are of Asian descent in terms of being different from other marginalized groups? What's unique to the marginalization of those of Asian descent that's different?
Yeah, I'll start. I think it's the biggest things is like tied into the cultural stereotypes and cultural things. So in Asian cultures, like their stereotypes of people is to they're quiet. They don't, stereotype of Asian people are like they don't speak up, and then so like I think fighting against those stereotype of Asian cultures, like the people who grow up in Asian culture, the biggest challenge, but also like somewhat true as well that I grew up in the culture too. Like I was raised to avoid confrontations and like conflict with others. Like I was raised to be like level as other people, try not to like get up. Like there's like a Japanese expression that there's like a one line here, and if you go get up a little bit up, you get hit. So I was always taught not to go get up from other, get up. So that's the culture that I grew up with. So that's that. I think the cultural background of like Asian, if we say Asian, East Asian culture, I guess when we are talking about here, are the challenges compared to the other marginalized group.
Yeah, I think the idea of like the model minority stereotype or myth, what Kanai is saying really I think speaks to that, because I think oftentimes I think about it like it kind of comes from both sides. It comes from our own families and culture, right? And so, nouveau term that's becoming hot is like intergenerational trauma, right? So I had the same experience as Kanai. It's like, oh, don't ruffle feathers, don't speak up, don't stand out because you just want to fit in. Like, for goodness sake, like we brought you to this country, you need to fit in. Like, don't make people kick us out, And I know that was a very strong message my parents sent to me and my siblings, right? So it was exactly what Kanai is explaining, right? Like, do not, like, if this is where everyone is, like, do not try and stand out anywhere above that line, or, you don't want to get mowed down, essentially. And I think it really, so coming from sort of the family side, you get that cultural pressure, right? And I think part of that is trauma experienced by people who were immigrants or refugees, or, out of fear, right, of being essentially kicked out of, where they've just arrived. I think on the other side, the model minority myth, it's this idea of, oh, Asians, and a lot of times I agree with Kanai, it's based off of an interpretation of Eastern Asian culture. They're quiet, they're passive, they're accommodating, they work really hard, they do great work, and they can handle a lot of work. And they don't push back. And so you can essentially just tell them what to do and they're going to do it, and the quality is going to be great. And so, I think to a lot of people, it's like, well, then what's the problem? That sounds great. It sounds like everyone's saying that East Asians are amazing. But I would encourage people to think about it in terms of the pressure that puts on, especially, second, third, et cetera, generation Asians that are, say, in North America or wherever that's perhaps not, where their family is originally from. As you move through, and if you go into whatever career you go into, people who perhaps implicitly believe in this model minority myth, there is a lot of pressure on you to perform. There is a lot of expectation. There is a lot of expectation for you to constantly agree, to not push back. And over time, what it turns into is you really get a strong perception that your self-worth is purely grounded in your ability to work hard and produce things for people. And so, I will personally say almost every second of the day, I feel guilty because there's something I'm not working on that I told someone I was going to work on. And so as time goes on, it becomes quite mentally taxing, and it's quite draining and it's exhausting. And I think these are things that when people hear about the model minority myth, they don't think about, perhaps, which makes sense. If you don't live the culture, it's hard to really understand what it might feel like. But that's what it feels like to me.
Can I also add one more answer to this question? Maybe go to the different one too. But sometimes the challenges I feel as Asian people, and then talking about being marginalized group, when especially in the United States, because I never lived in Canada. So like, let's say when we talk about United States, when we talk about like a race or like just a marginalized group, oftentimes like the Asian group get left out, or like don't get too much attention about our experience, or like the experience of discriminations that we have in this society. So I think that's a challenge that I don't know, because we don't speak up enough. I'm not sure, but like in this country, United States, coming from Japan and then like being here, like I hear that people talk about like discriminations and like other races and stuff like that, but I don't hear a lot often about like the topic on Asian people. I think that's a challenge that we face too.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that, I think about, I agree with Kanai in that I think oftentimes we're, Asian people are sort of like painted in this like light of like, oh, look at this group of immigrants, through hard work and perseverance, and like they made it. And when you read some of the model minority literature, it talks about how sort of that perception, that use of Asians as sort of this, look, this group could do it, so you could do it, and like this other group could do it, so we don't really understand why really people are saying racism is a problem. This other race was able to be effective, successful, whatever. So can you. And so there's literature that really talks about how the model minority myth is used as a wedge, to really to really keep different groups that perhaps are undersupported, underrepresented, from really being able to collectively push anti-racism or anti-discrimination, and then on the other side, it really isolates Asians, because they feel like, well, I'm not white enough to be white, and I'm not ethnic enough to be considered a group that experiences racism or discrimination. So a lot of times you just feel like you're invisible. I don't know, Kanai, if you have that experience.
Right. And then at the same time, we do get discriminated. We do have experience, but then there's not much opportunity for us to speak up about it, or there's not much attention from the society,
So that leads to the deeper question, right? The harder question that sometimes gets to ask. We have to do that self-reflection as a field. And so, well, this question's about kinesiology as a whole. Then we're going to talk about academia as a whole in a second, so that way you can focus. But what are some of the assumptions or biases that you think are found inside the field of kinesiology as it relates to those of Asian descent?
Yeah, Kanai, I really like you
talking
about your coaching experience.
Yeah, it's a big time. I think it's big, because in kinesiology is related to sports and physical activities, and then the assumptions and bias or the stereotypes people have with Asian people of not being interested in sports, or not athletics, or like they're usually the people, when people talk think about Asian, they think about, they're like, okay, they're not really athletics, or they're not interested in sports. So then that assumption is there, that the field of kinesiology tied with sports and physical activities. So I know that Danielle mentions that there were quite few Asian scholars in the particular field in kinesiology. But for example, my field is sports pedagogy and in physical education and coaching. So when in my field is a very limited number of Asian scholar to begin with. Then on top of that, Asian female scholar is very, very small. So that's because of that, you know, the assumptions we have. And then like also like Jenny talked about this, maybe you should, talk about this one too, that how our families values or like about the field of kinesiology or just sports in general are very really influencing the Asian people or Asian female to going into this field of kinesiology too.
Yeah, I think it's another sort of one of those two-sided things where, one side of it is, sort of from our cultural side, I had shared with Daniel and Kanai, so I played baseball. I played boys and men's baseball for quite a time. I played women's baseball, and I also played some softball. And I retired 3 times, but I played until I was in my early 30s. And I started playing when I was maybe six, let's say. And in that time span, playing, I played at very high levels. My parents did not support it, especially my dad. And they never saw me compete. They never came to a practice. And they were, very much against it for a long period in my life. And so you sort of have pressure and explicit verbal messaging from your family that this is not a valuable path for you to go down. And then the other side that Kanai has spoken to is sort of because you are underrepresented in your field in kinesiology. So my area is sport and exercise psychology, and just quickly thinking, I can literally think of two people two other people who are Asian, one person who's half Asian, and one person who's a quarter Asian. And I've been in this area. I started my master's degree in like 2003. And I can literally think of 4 people that are in my specific area. So then on the other side, we're also underrepresented, and then I think, sometimes that throws people for a loop because, when you show up and you're Asian in kinesiology and you're in a discipline that doesn't have a lot of other Asians in it, people are sort of thrown off to begin with. But then if you're outspoken, if you're confident, if you have ideas and opinions versus being passive and quiet and accommodating and agreeing to everything, I think on some level, it sort of messes with people a little bit too, in terms of having trouble really processing and accepting the identity that's in front of them. And so I think the idea of intersectionality, so being Asian, being female, perhaps being, non-gender conforming or not aligned with the traditional gender stereotypes in terms of behaviors, actions, can be real challenging for people. And I've certainly been on the receiving end of it, and I know Kanai has as well. So it's an interesting perspective, being a person who's not, I don't really think of myself as being from a minority group, but within my discipline, I think, yes, we are definitely a minority.
Yeah, it is. I think this is the two, like you say, it's 2 important point that we are sharing, because it's the title of webinar is like lived experience, right? So you grew up as a female athlete, I grew up as female athletes, but then so much common between us. Like your parents never been at any of the games. My parents never seen my play, And then when we decided to go into the field of sports, like as an academia, they were like, "What? Like, why is not science? Why is not math? Whatever, Then like." But then when we finally got the doctor, they were like, okay, because there's a doctor on the top of the name. So that when Jenny shared that experience with us that the other day, I was just like, it is so like me. I had exactly the same experience. So, so that's that one lived experience that I think that people may not know, but then also like once we get into that field of kinesiology, it's I feel challenged all the time to prove myself that I know about sports, because again, there are stereotypes out there that Asian people are don't know much about sports, not good at about sports. So like especially in coaching or the competitive sports, like yeah, there's a clear like discriminatory experience that I have had. For example, like I sent the email to certain people and then like never get back. Then like somebody else who have less male, like from Western culture, the white male sent almost this experience, sent a similar email to the certain person, and then he gets mail back right away. So it's just little things like that. Uh, um, uh, we have experienced those little things. Just need to prove myself more because of that, the characteristic or uniqueness of that field here.
Yeah, I think that you guys kind of nailed it right in the head, that conversation that we had that you expanded on, that the interesting marginalization in the subfields that we are as part of kinesiology, right? Where it wouldn't be unexpected. And this is the hard part because I'm coming in with what I hear, which is usually on the outside, right? That concept. If someone told me, well, there's a Asian faculty member that's coming in, or a faculty member of Asian descent, the automatic assumption, okay, so they're probably a physiologist or fall within a similar field, or sport management, which we have a larger representation in, versus both of you are in fields that have far less representation that we've seen in pedagogy and psychology and so forth. So I do appreciate you guys sharing that, which kind of bounces to the next question that has broader ramifications, though, which is, what are the other unconscious biasness that we might find kind of in academia or in higher ed in general that we deal with?
I mean, I think something that, and admittedly, this is something that I've really been heavily focused on the last several years, with our cultural shift to really put issues surrounding equity and inclusion and diversity sort of under the microscope. And so in terms of unconscious biases, I think where we're at, in my personal opinion, is I think a lot of people, may still have a lack of clarity on sort of this issue surrounding, there's been such a push about, anti-racism, this calling out, if you will, of things that perhaps are actually grounded in implicitly racist beliefs and attitudes. And I think that that's a real hard pill for people to swallow. And I don't just mean white people, right? I am a person that does believe that everybody is a little bit racist, and that, maybe that sounds too casual, that maybe that's too casually, put out there. But, I know when I started, when I first started at Cal State East Bay, I think a lot of PhDs, you come in and you're all amped up and you're ready to go. And so you're like, I'm going to establish my lab, or, I'm going to, get situated with my research program. And, reflecting now, 10, 12 years later, I can think of several racist structures that I had in place that were grounded in sort of, the correct level would be white supremacy, but that doesn't mean like white supremacy like KKK and overtly like, being racist with intentionality. It's more so, more broadly, higher education was, in North America, was founded and created by a very homogenous group of individuals who happen to be white and who happen to be male, who happen to be middle to upper class. And so when you think about it that way, and the label white supremacy, it's, to me, what that really means is like the people who created the systems and the structures that we are having to function in just happen to be a much more homogenous group that didn't have any representation of me in there, but everything they created was not with ill intent. It was just, we're creating this based off of our lens and our perspective. And so that's why a lot of our systems and structures in higher education are currently designed to very well support, middle class white males particularly, versus it being like the system that has been set up to intentionally oppress other groups, is sort of the way I look at it. I don't know if, your perspective on it.
No, I totally agree. I want to add one more thing. Is like just in academia, maybe not kinesiology particularly too, but like also like the people with accent, like maybe I can speak more of that too. So like as soon as you people hear the accent, or people recognize that that person doesn't have perfect English, right away there's assumption that they know less. You know, that's I think that might be speaking from more like international perspective than Asian perspective per se. But you know, there are many Asian people in our field or in academias that who have an accent or doesn't speak or write English as a first language, and then there is a definitely unconscious bias toward those people. You know, maybe they can experience, they know the certain content in their language more than you, but maybe like because they don't explain well enough in English, you know, that person get treated less. So I don't know that where that fits into it, but there is definitely the unconscious bias, the discrimination or just the mistreatment um, based on the assumption that if you don't have a perfect English, that person are not smart enough or like don't know as much as you do. So yeah, I just want to add that part too.
Yeah, I mean, I have, so for me, I have, you know, I think being a North American, like I would label it as I have the privilege of having a North American accent. I'll put it that way, right? But I'll also, you know, I have experience being in meetings, in committees, on groups where perhaps there's other Asians and they do have accents, and I notice that I'm treated differently. And I agree with Kanaya. You know, I do find that sometimes people make that false connection that, oh, your English isn't, you know, quote unquote perfect, and I think there's some subconscious linking of it to like you don't know this stuff as well, which
Right.
is bizarre when you say it out loud. But I have observed that happen in meetings where I'll be given more. I don't want to use the word respect, but I'll be kind of given more trust, space, you know, whereas individuals with an accent, it almost feels like people are dismissive.
Right. So again, I don't know where that fits into it, but like when you're Asian and when you're female and then have an accent to it, I think there's like a triple challenges that, you know, like people may not be aware that the person is facing to, you know, has to try to get over that hurdle.
Yeah, and then the other side of the coin is that it's also sometimes surprising to people when you don't have
Right.
an Eastern Asian accent, right? So like I shared this story with Kanai and Daniel. You know, my earliest times at East Bay, I was at some campus event and I was introduced to a person. She was an older white woman, and the person introducing me was like, "Oh, this is Jenny. She's finished her PhD." Blah, blah, blah. And so the person, reached out to me and was like, "Hi, I'm so-and-so." And so I was like, "Oh, hi, I'm Jenny. Like, I'm really excited to be here." And her response to me was, "Wow, your English is so good." And so, and to me in my head, I was like, "Oh my gosh, what do I say in response to this?" And I think my response was, "Oh, thanks. I grew up in Canada," kind of just trying to kind of get through that as quickly as possible. But that was probably one of my first experiences where I'm at with sort of the implicitly held beliefs and assumptions about Asian people in academia, whether it's kinesiology or academia more broadly. It's interesting. It's like you're kind of like in the middle. It's like, again, I'm not white enough and I'm not foreign enough. It's like,
right. Yeah, I love that story, Jenny.
I'm gonna jump in here before we go to our next question. Why a lot of these are scaffold to build on top of each other. We had a question come in from Penny that I thought was interesting. I'm gonna post it up based on its length. I'll see if it covers too much of the screen. I'll have to take it back down, just read it. But thank you, Penny. I really appreciate it. But the question was, I've only visited Asian countries 3 times, once in Korea, twice in China. I thought I was treated much differently than my male academic colleagues on the same trip. Do you feel being a woman has personified your experience in a different way than your male counterparts?
I guess, I mean, I'll share my personal thoughts on this. So, one thing, Penny, I would say, when you're visiting these countries, typically women and older women, Penny. So, like, I know you're a little bit past 40, but so I know that they're held in very high regard, right? There's this big, valuing of mothers and women in East Asian cultures, and so there's sort of a degree of, you must treat them really well, you must be really respectful, especially if they're like a quote unquote elder, right? And so I think that may have been part of feeling a different experience. And the other thing that I thought about in response to your question, Penny, is, culturally, like, say I can speak to Chinese culture, right? Like, I've got an older brother, and in our culture, the men are, in a sense, sort of treated like kings, right? They don't really get assigned chores. They don't really have to do anything other than, they're just encouraged, like, do your schoolwork. That's all you got to worry about. You don't need to cook. You don't need to clean. You don't need to anything else other than make sure that you basically become a doctor or a lawyer. Is my culture, like, that's the social pressure, the pressure culturally. My sister and I, on the other hand, same pressure, right? So, academics is number one, but then also you must learn how to cook, you must learn how to clean, you must learn how to take care of a man, do all these things. And so when when talking about differences between male and female Asians in kinesiology or academia, I think part of it depends on whether they would identify as, whether Asian American, or if they're identifying, how strongly their cultural background has influenced sort of their beliefs and attitudes in today's world, like where they're currently at. If they're sort of if they're heavily influenced by their Eastern culture, Eastern culture males are trained to just do your job. All you're supposed to do is your job, and if you do your job really well, that's what you're supposed to do. And so they will volunteer. They are trained. They're socialized to value service work less, to value sort of any of the extras less. And as long as they're hitting their research goals, perhaps teaching if they're at a teaching school, then that's how they were culturally, raised to focus. Whereas for Asian women, it's sort of like you have to do this like Swiss Army knife, it's sort of how I feel like I was raised, right? It's like you basically have to be able to do everything and do everything well. So you need to be able to do your academics as well as a man, but you also do all these other things, right? And so, yeah, I think it's a very different experience.
Yeah, I can definitely echo that too. I think gender inequality is huge, huge in I'm not gonna say Asian country because I don't know every single Asian countries, but definitely in Japan or in nearby countries, females are not just scholarly, but just females or women or girls are seen inferior to males. That's our society. You'd surprise maybe being in the United States. People here who watching it might be surprised if you're in the United States, growing up in the United States, being more like progressive side of thoughts. It is still real there, and then very sad to see. But it's in that, like Jenny said, like females are still expected to do stay home and raise a child, do homework, do the housekeeping things, and then like academic things are maybe not as important as male, but male are that's their things to do. So I think it's very, very important to know recognize that too, because I think being in your Western culture or being in the United States, sometimes you forget that. But because of the inequality happening still in the Asian culture, and we are still dealing with this in the United States too. Like again, like if you going back to like family pressure, like you still have the family pressure of like, what are you why are you so working so much? What are you doing with your family? All that kind of things. I hear that a lot too. So when I had, for example, this, because this is a lived experience talk. So if I share my story, it's like when I had my kids, my first question from my sister and my mom was like, can you take at least like 3 years off from your work, focusing on raising your child? And it was just like 3 years of work. I mean, like, that'd be great if you, I don't know, but like, that's like, they were like, why are you working, kind of thing. I was like, those are the things just need to like, I would try to explain it to them that you can do both, as a female. But their perception is like, if you have a kid, a baby, why are you working? And then like, they were like asking me that, can you at least take me like 3 years off from your work? And I was just like, people maybe take like a year, but maybe not a 3 years, that. But those are the little questions that you feel like, why are you working when you're having a kid, kind of things, that's definitely real, and it's still happening, believe it or not.
Yeah, we had a response from Penny in response to what y'all provided. I'll just throw that up real quick to move on to the next question, just knowing that it's still real here as well for women. So the question I think I want to get, because I know we're on our 15 minutes left of time, and so one of the things I definitely want to handle is the basic ideas. What are your recommendations for those in the field to handle the biasness that we have, especially for those in administrative roles?
I think self-reflection is really important. To me, that's, and my bias as a cognitive behavioral scientist, right? I think all actions are predicated by thought. So if you've got a particular thought, that's going to drive the ultimate action you choose to take. And so if an individual hasn't really reflected on, where am I at in terms of what I believe about different groups, different cultures? Do I carry any biases that I'm not aware of? How has that played out in how I structure my research, my lab, my mentoring of students, my teaching of students? Are there ways in which perhaps some biases that I'm holding are potentially negatively impacting those that I'm trying to serve? So a quick example, there's stuff in the model minority literature that talks about how oftentimes Asian students are not provided with additional support and assistance, largely in part driven by the model minority myth, in that, oh, they're smart and they're capable, I'm just going to push them, right? So it's more of a, and I over the years, I had so many teachers say this to me: if I didn't do as well as they expected of me on something, like instead of saying, oh, what's going on, like, is there something I can help with, or something along those lines. It's more, I was surprised by that. I was surprised by what you submitted, or I was surprised that you didn't do as well as you normally do. And so it's more of a like, oh, I'm surprised, and and that's driven by the thought that, oh, well, Asians are capable and smart, and so people, I think just implicitly assume, oh, well, we can just work harder and we'll be just fine. And so self-reflection, really thinking about what biases do I hold that I perhaps wasn't aware of previously.
Yeah, going on to that, the self-reflection, everyone has unconscious bias. I do, you do, everyone has, so I think the self-reflection is definitely just being aware of that we do have. But then on top of that, I would say, hire them, like give them a chance, like if you see Asian scholars, or let's say Asian scholars, because that's our topic here, like maybe you have unconscious thoughts. I'll say, she or he may not know much about the sports or coaching or whatever, but give them a chance. But then I want to add that too. I think we talked about that, previously. But after we give them a chance to hire, make sure that you know that as an Asian people, we don't know many Asian people in our field. So we don't have a lot of people to go to at the ask, share same experience. I'm super glad that now I met Jenny here. Just like, but I don't know many Asian people in our field that may have a similar experience. Not about our contents and stuff like that. More just like the more like deep experience that we can share. So like when you hire somebody like Asian people, somebody like us, that make sure and please know that they don't have a lot of like mentorship in terms of like somebody who can share similar experience. So giving the like guidance and mentorship is critical, so they can be successful, and then they can stay in the field and then be at their potential.
And to add, I want to add on to what Kanai is saying, and if you've got the situation, you've got perhaps someone that's of Asian descent and they're new. What's not helpful is if they share something with you that's stressing them out or that they're finding challenging or they're trying to figure out. What's not helpful is if the assistance you offer is explaining how it works here, right? And so what I mean by that is if I am explaining to you that I'm feeling guilty about not working on X when I'm working on Y, if your response is, well, you shouldn't feel that bad. I mean, it's really busy here and everyone's got lots on their plate. So don't feel too terrible about that. If you're informed about the model minority myth, this is one of the things that Asians feel is extreme guilt about not working or not working enough or not doing work that's good enough, because we are forced to sort of adopt this belief that our work is such a defining part of our identity, right? Because of this myth that we are held to. So if your response is, oh, everybody's experiencing that, don't worry, don't be too stressed out about it, it's really dismissive. And it's really not recognizing the unique cultural pressure that we feel to constantly excel and produce high volumes of work. So if an Asian person is actually sharing that with you, it is a show of trust that they're willing to be vulnerable, because we're also not supposed to be that.
Very true. So, very true.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This leads to two questions I have, and I've been kicking around how to ask this last one. We even all talked about it a little bit. So do you think really that, we have some more issues in racism, more overt actions of racism against those of Asian descent have definitely existed, and they've only been more come to light in the media due to issues with COVID of recent times? Or has issues around COVID actually increased the frequency of overt racist acts against those of Asian descent? And I tried to do some research on this, and I couldn't find a background either or. So that's
my opinion. I would say both. It was there, but it was not talked.
Mm-hmm.
And then because of that, because of what happened against the Asian people during the COVID pandemics, it was raised. And then, now you see documentary about that, that is great. But then at the same time, because of that, COVID pandemics and the racial discrimination against Asian people during COVID increased more discrimination as well. So I would say both of that too. Both are true.
Yeah, and I think that there's sort of a couple of confounds too that make it really difficult to really, I think, tease it out. And I think we've also become much more politically charged, right, in recent years. I think that contributed to it. And then I think also social media, the ability to be anywhere in the world in a couple of clicks right on your phone. So I think, yeah, there has always been, I've got some horrific stories that I won't share of overt racism my family experienced over the years when I was growing up. I think it's always existed, but I think it's a lot easier to see it because of technology now. I wouldn't say, I guess I don't know if it's gotten worse, to be honest, versus it's just easier to actually observe it happening.
So my last question, I think, we've got some stuff going on here, is since we actually all met, Disney has produced its latest hit that's come out and been successful. And for those who have kids, you probably already watched it, but Turning Red came out. Literally, that came out between when we met the first time and we got a chance to meet now. So this is a question on the blue. They didn't see this coming, so I do apologize in advance. But someone asked me about it yesterday when they heard I was doing this webinar. I was like, I don't know. Do you think films like Turning Red, which was, it's, by the way, the first film I think Disney's done for its animated films directed by a female, and is done by a female of Asian descent.
Yeah, from Canada.
Yeah, which I mean, I think that comes out pretty straight in the movie. The movie's about a young girl growing up in the 90s who's in Toronto, who is of Asian descent, and trying to balance those worlds of being a lot of the topics we've talked about today. Do you think that films like that, or this process where we're kind of seeing more introductions like this through media, like books and so forth, and especially like movies like this, do a good job at trying to get the normalization down of some of the stuff you guys faced growing up? And you may not have seen the film, so that's fair too. But
can I have you seen it? Have you seen the film?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, me too. So, so I grew up in Toronto, and so it was neat to see that representation. For me, it was doubly because it was both my Canadian and my Chinese side being represented, and I thought they did a very good job of representing, especially the intergenerational trauma that is carried by each generation that passes. And because Eastern Asian culture, at least, is very protective of their children, and very, in a sense, like, I guess similar to helicopter parents in a sense, in that, we're very strictly controlled. Like, I will tell everyone, I've never been to a birthday party. I never went to a sleepover until I was actually an adult and got to decide for myself. We weren't allowed to do those types of things because, one, it was an imposition on the people hosting, and two, we just don't do that, right? But so I thought it was a great representation and some just insights into what it might be like to grow up as someone in, say for me, like grow up as a Canadian, but have such a strong cultural, Eastern Chinese cultural upbringing. And so, me and my siblings used to say all the time, during the day we go to school, we go to Canada, and then we go back home to Vietnam when we go home after school, because it's a complete culture shift. So I guess in some forms, it's almost like I don't even know if code switching makes sense, but it's like you would go to school and act a certain way, and then you go home and you would act a very different sort of way.
I liked it because so I'm raising my kids, like half American and half Japanese here, and then watching that kind of movie with my kids is, like, so when they are not growing up in that kind of culture, but they have something to like connect with, like it's not just like a white pretty girl or like brown hair only on the movie. It's like now I think Disney does good job. Disney does good job on the diversity wise. But anyway, Encanto and all that. But anyway, I think it's that you have a kid, you watch this one too. But anyway, so like I liked the movie because like representing an Asian culture, and then like some cool things about Asian culture too. So then also the intergenerational struggles that like we go through, like say we wanted to be in the sports or the field of kinesiology, which is unheard of, like 20 years ago, right? Female Asian going into the kinesiology is unheard of in Asian culture, maybe some, I'm sure, but not that common, right? But then like we are in that intergenerational, struggles there. So I liked it though.
Yeah, and I did like how they highlighted, sort of like the idea of the red panda being this essentially, to me, the way I interpreted it was, I thought they were really accurate in identifying, like, you're taught to repress your emotions. Like you're supposed, as I was raised very much, it's like, oh no, you do not display emotion. You do not yell, cry, scream, can't be overly happy. You can't be overly sad. And so to me, it was just, I really connected with the movie because I'm like, that is exactly how I felt growing up. I guess it's this red panda that we're not allowed to be, right? That is exactly my experience growing up in Toronto.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, not that I'm throwing an endorsement out there that relates to American Kinesiology Association, but as a dad, I will say, coming as a middle-aged white male that I am now, I love watching it with my kids because we did have to pause often, and I did have to do a lot of explanations.
Mm.
And I love that because it meant my kids are learning something that they don't understand because it's not our home and how things operate in our home. However, you both very much are like, no, that's how it felt growing up. And so, I think that's awesome. I agree with you. Disney has done a breakthrough job lately with some diversity movies, with Encanto being from Colombia, I believe, if I recall correctly, and then Turning Red being a great example of that kind of South Asian culture issues. We're still ignoring ones they've done the past 2 years, but I think that movie specifically really helped capture the experience of that time period and how most you probably grew up. And that intergenerational conflicts that you talk about are things that I had to spend time trying to figure out how to explain in a non-academic terms to my 8-year-old, But I think hopefully that will help with few friends they do have, hopefully of Asian descent, better understand where they come from, where some of the shift or changes that are still there that they deal with. So again, my hope that it just slowly normalizes different expectations, whether it be about what someone brings to lunch for someday, for food, or something as simple as that. So I've got a few comments about people saying that the movie's definitely on their list, or okay, yeah, kids, I plan on watching. We haven't gotten there yet, so that's awesome. But that's the only questions I had for you guys. Did you guys have any parting words you want to leave?
I can start. Danielle said, this webinar was came from the request of something like that topic. I appreciate that very much. I think it's like I said before, there is a less attention or less focus on like I said, I don't want to say Asian, but like an Asian descent people, and then our experience. There's less opportunity for us to share our experience and then maybe our challenges. So when I heard that there were some requests, something like this topic, I was just like, wow, this is so cool that there are some people out there who are interested in, and knowing about our experience and maybe how we can improve the field of kinesiology being more inclusive, like truly inclusive, So I appreciate that part.
Yeah, and I'll add, I don't know, last parting thoughts. I would love to encourage people to really, I think it's clear that generally speaking, everyone is supportive of equity and inclusion as an idea. So I guess in terms of final thoughts, I would encourage people to think about what's one thing I can do to enhance my understanding of what does that actually mean and how might that actually be expressed to be more inclusive and equitable, versus writing a statement or taking a stand in a written form, right? Do something, try and do something, and be informed with the something that you do. So speak to people who either have specialized training in issues surrounding DEI or who perhaps have lived experiences that they can share with you, and do something would be my last message.
Excellent. I want to thank you guys so much. You guys were wonderful and taking time out to share. A lot of times when we invite people on here, it's very much their professional, promotion. Here, you guys came on and shared a lot of personal information as well, since it's dealing with your lived experiences, and expressing that time of vulnerability to us is huge. I appreciate that immensely. Additionally, for those out there, especially those watching and so forth, if you guys have any other topics or things of interest you want to send, my email is listed right there on the screen. Please send. Obviously, we will work our best to get them to fit in and belong as best we can. I do have a couple more coming up. Some of that are DEI, some that are not. That are requested topics. We're getting there. So if you have any questions or topics you want me to interview or look into, by all means, send it to us, and the American Kinesiology Association will sit down and try to figure out the best way to fill that request. So I want to take everyone and say thank you so much for coming today, especially our two speakers. Kanai, Jenny, you guys are amazing. I appreciate it. And everyone else watching, thank you so much for your support that you had, both giving questions and sharing and liking. So take care, everyone.